If your world seems to be collapsing for no logical reason and time is moving too fast, as if reality itself is losing consistency, know that your brain is not failing. The three-dimensional fabric around you is literally collapsing at this very second. But the real question the universe is forcing you to face now is this: will you be swallowed by the fall of this old system, or are you ready to take full control before the next glitch in the matrix hits you? Pause for a moment and feel your body. Notice your breath without changing it. There's something here that wasn't clear before. The patterns you used to trust are breaking, and that discomfort is not random. It's a signal. What once felt stable is losing structure because you are no longer the same. The simulation is adjusting, and that adjustment creates friction. You might feel lost, but look closer. This is the exact point where awareness separates from automatic living. The script you followed is no longer running the same way, and right here, in this unstable space, a new level of control becomes possible. Do you know that horrible feeling of being surrounded by people, living your daily routine, yet feeling a hole in your stomach as if you were a complete stranger watching an empty theater? This is not depression or chronic exhaustion. Quantum physics explains this as a frequency mismatch. Your consciousness has rapidly expanded, but the matter around you is still trying to run the old program of your past. That's why everything in your life feels so heavy and painful lately. What's really happening is more subtle than it first appears. Your perception has sharpened, almost like someone quietly adjusted the lens through which you see reality. Conversations that once felt normal now sound repetitive or empty. Places that used to comfort you now feel dense, almost suffocating. Even your own habits, things you used to do without thinking, start to feel unnatural, like wearing clothes that no longer fit your body. This is the overload of the conscious observer. Your mind is no longer just reacting to the simulation, it's noticing it, and that changes everything. Before, your attention flowed automatically into routines, distractions, and expectations. Now, there's a gap between what's happening and how you experience it. You see the patterns. You notice how people repeat the same emotional loops, how situations replay with different faces but identical outcomes. It's like watching the same scene performed over and over again, just with new actors. And the strange part is, you can't unsee it. This creates a kind of internal pressure, not because something is wrong with you, but because your system is processing more information than it used to. Imagine upgrading a device without updating the environment around it. The device becomes faster, more precise, more aware, but everything else stays slow and outdated. That friction is what you're feeling right now. It shows up in small, almost invisible ways. You might feel tired even after resting, not because your body is weak, but because your awareness is constantly scanning. You might lose interest in things that used to excite you, not because you've become empty, but because those things no longer match your current level of perception. Even social interactions can feel draining, as if you're carrying the weight of conversations that don't actually go anywhere. And then comes the confusion. Because the world will try to label this state incorrectly. It will tell you that you're burned out, that you need to distract yourself more, that you should go back to normal. But what if normal is exactly what your system is trying to move beyond? The overload isn't a failure, it's a transition. Your awareness is expanding faster than your external reality can reorganize itself. And that gap between inner expansion and outer structure is where the discomfort lives. It's not permanent, but it is intense, especially when you don't yet understand what's causing it. There's also something else happening beneath the surface. As your consciousness expands, it starts to question everything automatically. Not in a dramatic or rebellious way, but quietly, almost mechanically. Why am I doing this? Why does this matter? Why does this feel off? These questions don't come from negativity. They come from clarity trying to emerge. But clarity at first feels like disorientation. Because when the old meanings dissolve, nothing immediately replaces them. You're left in a kind of open space where things haven't reorganized yet, and that space can feel uncomfortable, even unsettling, if you're expecting instant answers. This is where many people misinterpret the experience. They assume something is wrong and try to fix it as quickly as possible. They rush to fill the space with new beliefs, new routines, or forced positivity. But that reaction doesn't resolve the overload. It amplifies it, because now, instead of observing the shift, they're resisting it. And resistance creates more friction than the expansion itself. If you pay close attention, you'll notice that the discomfort spikes when you try to force yourself back into old patterns, when you pretend things still feel the same, when you ignore what your perception is clearly showing you. The simulation doesn't crash all at once. It destabilizes in layers, and right now you're feeling the first signs of that instability, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a quiet misalignment between who you've become and the reality still trying to hold you in place. That's why everything feels heavier than it should. Not because life suddenly got worse, but because you're no longer fully inside the illusion that made it feel manageable. You're standing slightly outside of it now, observing it, and that position requires a different kind of energy. The question is not how to escape this feeling. The real question is what you're going to do with this new level of awareness. Because the way most people respond at this exact point is where the real trap begins to form. And this is where the overwhelming majority falls into an invisible and brutal trap. When they feel this strangeness, they panic and try to vibrate high at all costs, exhausting themselves fighting their own daily problems. I will explain in a moment how this desperation to fix things is the exact mechanism that chains you to the same cycles of pain year after year. But first, you need to clearly see what the walls of this prison crushing your chest are made of. The trap doesn't look like something negative at first. It actually disguises itself as growth. You start consuming more content, repeating affirmations, forcing gratitude, trying to override every uncomfortable emotion as quickly as it appears. On the surface, it feels like you're doing the right thing. It feels proactive, almost disciplined. But underneath, something subtle is happening. You're rejecting your own direct experience. Instead of observing what's real, you begin editing it. And that's where the distortion begins inside the simulation. Because the moment you try to force yourself into a constant, high state, you create an internal division. One part of you is still feeling confusion, heaviness, even frustration. The other part is trying to suppress all of that with artificial positivity. These two layers don't integrate, they collide. And that collision generates even more tension than the original discomfort ever did. This is why after a while people feel exhausted, not because awareness is too heavy, but because they are constantly fighting against their own perception. They are trying to control the output of their reality without understanding the input. It's like trying to change the reflection in a mirror by smiling harder, instead of looking at what's actually creating the expression. And the simulation responds to that conflict in a very precise way. It amplifies whatever is unresolved. So the more you try to escape a feeling, the more persistent it becomes. The more you try to fix your reality from a place of urgency, the more unstable it appears. Not as punishment, but as feedback. The system is showing you that force is not the language that creates alignment. But most people misunderstand this feedback completely. They interpret it as failure. They think, I'm not doing it right. I need to try harder. I need to be more positive, more disciplined, more aligned. And without realizing it, they double down on the exact behavior that's keeping them stuck. The effort increases, the frustration grows, and the cycle repeats with more intensity each time. This is the fatal error, believing that awareness requires constant control. In reality, awareness requires space. There's a difference between guiding your attention and trying to dominate your internal state. One creates clarity, the other creates resistance, and resistance, even when disguised as self-improvement, is still resistance. The simulation doesn't interpret your intentions, it responds to your actual state. If your state is tension, even if it's dressed up as positivity, the output will carry that same tension. This is why things can start to feel fake. You say the right words, you follow the right practices, but something inside doesn't fully agree. There's a quiet dissonance that you can't ignore anymore. And that dissonance is not a problem, it's a signal. It's showing you that you've moved beyond surface-level adjustments. You're being pushed towards something more honest, but honesty at this stage can feel uncomfortable because it asks you to stop performing, even internally. It asks you to see what is actually happening without immediately trying to change it. And for someone who has been taught that control equals progress, this can feel like doing nothing. It can feel like going backward. In truth, it's the opposite. It's the first moment where you stop feeding unnecessary noise into the system. When you stop forcing yourself to feel a certain way, something unexpected begins to happen. The intensity of your emotions starts to shift on its own. Not instantly, not dramatically, but subtly. The pressure begins to loosen, not because you fought it, but because you stopped reinforcing it. This is where a different kind of intelligence starts to emerge. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin to notice. Instead of correcting everything, you allow certain things to reveal themselves. And in that space, patterns become clearer, not because you analyze them, but because you finally gave them room to be seen. And what you start to notice next changes how you understand everything around you. Because the problems that once felt solid and immovable begin to look different. Not gone, not solved, but less rigid than they appeared before. Almost as if their structure depends on something you hadn't considered yet. Something subtle, but constant. Something tied to the way you perceive and repeat them inside your own mind. And once you begin to see that, it becomes impossible to ignore what these obstacles are really made of. When you look at your debts, your loneliness, or your anxiety, the obstacles seem concrete and unbreakable. However, through the lens of quantum mechanics, physical matter is proven to be 99.99% empty space. What haunts you the most today is just a dense package of holographic information. And what keeps this information solid in front of you is the continuous friction force of your own mental repetition. This doesn't mean your problems are imaginary or that they don't matter. It means their structure is not as fixed as it feels. What you are experiencing is not just the situation itself, but the way your mind continuously interacts with it. The memory, the anticipation, the emotional charge, these elements wrap around the raw event and give it weight, texture, and persistence. In the simulation, repetition is what creates density. Think about how often a single concern runs through your mind in a day. Not once or twice, but dozens of times, sometimes without you even noticing. Each time you revisit it, you're not just remembering, you're reinforcing. You're adding another layer of attention, another layer of emotional energy, another layer of perceived solidity. Over time, that accumulation makes the issue feel permanent. But if you slow down and observe carefully, you'll notice something unusual. The problem itself is rarely present in its full form. What's present are fragments, thoughts, images, sensations that your mind stitches together into something that feels continuous. It's like watching individual frames of a film so quickly that they appear as one seamless scene. And your attention is the projector. Without that constant projection, the structure begins to loosen. Not disappear instantly, but soften. The edges become less rigid. The certainty around it starts to fade. This is not denial. It's a shift in how the information is being held in your system. Most people never see this because they are too busy reacting. They feel something uncomfortable and immediately engage with it, trying to solve it, resist it, or escape it. But in doing so, they lock their attention onto the very pattern they want to dissolve. The more they focus on it with urgency, the more defined it becomes. This is the hidden mechanism. The simulation doesn't need to trap you with force. It stabilizes itself through your participation, through your focus, through the way you revisit the same internal loops over and over again. And once you start noticing this, a quiet question begins to emerge. If the solidity of your problems depends on repetition, what happens when that repetition changes? Not by forcing yourself to think differently, but by interrupting the automatic cycle. Even for a few seconds, even in a subtle way. There's a moment, very small, almost invisible, where a thought hasn't fully formed yet. A gap between one repetition and the next. Most people rush past it without realizing it exists. But if you catch it, if you rest your attention there without immediately filling it, something shifts. The problem loses continuity. It's no longer a solid block. It becomes a series of separate events that don't fully connect unless you actively link them. And in that space, something unexpected appears. A sense of distance. Not emotional numbness, but clarity. The kind that lets you see without being pulled in. This is where the illusion begins to reveal itself, not as something mystical or abstract, but as a direct experience. You start to see that what felt heavy was being held together by constant mental engagement, and when that engagement softens, even slightly, the weight begins to redistribute. But this is also where things can feel unstable, because as the structure loosens, the mind tries to regain control. It brings the thoughts back, sometimes stronger, sometimes more urgent. It tries to convince you that the problem is still as solid as before. And if you're not aware of this reflex, you'll fall right back into the same loop, reinforcing it all over again. This push and pull creates a strange sensation. Moments of lightness followed by sudden heaviness, clarity followed by confusion. It can feel like you're moving forward and backward at the same time. But in reality, what you're experiencing is the system recalibrating. The old patterns are still active, but they're no longer unquestioned. And that makes them unstable, because once you've seen that the structure depends on your repetition, you can't fully believe in its permanence anymore. Even if it still shows up, something inside you knows there's more to it than what appears on the surface. That awareness changes how you relate to everything. Not instantly, not completely, but enough to create a subtle shift in your behavior. You pause a little more. You react a little less. You start to notice where your attention goes and what it does when it stays there too long. And as this awareness deepens, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because it's not just about individual thoughts or isolated problems. There's a larger movement happening, something that explains why these patterns seem to intensify all at once, as if your entire reality is accelerating under pressure. And to understand that, you have to look at how disorder itself begins to rise when old structures can no longer hold your current level of awareness. That's exactly why the chaos in your life seems to be getting out of control right now. First, a small project goes wrong. Then an appliance suddenly breaks until it explodes into an unexpected argument or a financial crisis overnight. This is the law of entropy in action. The simulation cannot sustain your new level of energetic expansion and begins to generate critical ruptures. If you try to solve these pressures using old fear, the chaos will escalate until it completely paralyzes you. At first, it feels like bad luck, random, unfair, even targeted. You start asking yourself why everything is happening at once, why there's no pause between one problem and the next. But what you're witnessing isn't randomness, it's a reorganization process. Systems that no longer match your current level of awareness begin to lose stability, and when stability drops, disorder naturally rises. Entropy is not destruction, it's exposure. It reveals where things were being artificially held together. That job you tolerated but never questioned. That relationship built more on habit than connection. That internal narrative you repeated for years without realizing it wasn't even yours anymore. As your perception sharpens, these structures can't maintain their previous form. They start to crack under the pressure of your own awareness. And those cracks don't appear quietly. They show up as inconveniences, delays, miscommunications, breakdowns. Small at first, almost dismissible, but when ignored, they begin to stack. One unresolved tension feeds the next, creating a chain reaction that feels overwhelming. Not because each event is massive on its own, but because together they create a sense of instability that your mind struggles to organize. This is where most people lose their footing. They interpret the rising chaos as a signal that something is going wrong, so they tighten their control. They react faster, think harder, try to fix everything immediately. But this reaction comes from the same pattern that is already collapsing. It's like trying to repair a shifting structure with the same materials that are already failing. The more urgency you bring into it, the more pressure you add to a system that is already unstable, and the simulation responds accordingly. It doesn't resist you, it mirrors you. If your internal state becomes rushed, tense, and reactive, your external experience begins to reflect that same rhythm. Situations accelerate, problems seem to multiply, time feels compressed, as if everything is happening faster than you can process. This is not because life is speeding up randomly, it's because your perception is now entangled with the instability you're trying to control. There's a subtle but critical shift that needs to happen here. Instead of seeing chaos as something to eliminate, you begin to see it as information. Each disruption carries a signal about what is no longer aligned. Each breakdown points to something that was being maintained out of inertia rather than clarity. When you stop treating these moments as enemies, they start to reveal their structure. You begin to notice patterns, not just in what is happening but in how you respond. The same emotional spikes, the same thoughts, the same urgency to regain control. And once you see that your reaction is part of the cycle, a new possibility opens, one where you don't immediately feed the escalation. Because escalation requires participation. Without your added tension, the chain reaction loses momentum. The events may still occur, but they don't compound in the same way. They pass through your experience instead of stacking on top of each other. And in that difference, something important starts to stabilize. Your sense of center. It doesn't mean everything suddenly becomes calm. It means you are no longer pulled in every direction by each new disruption. There's a slight delay between what happens and how you respond. And in that delay, you regain a form of choice that wasn't accessible before. But this is also where the system tests your consistency. As things begin to shift, there can be sudden spikes, moments where chaos intensifies again, almost as if trying to pull you back into the old rhythm. These moments are not setbacks, they are thresholds, points where the old pattern is trying to reassert itself before losing its grip completely. If you react the same way as before, the cycle resets. If you respond differently, even slightly, the pattern weakens. This is why the experience can feel like waves. Periods of calm followed by sudden turbulence. It's not linear, and it's not meant to be. The simulation is recalibrating in real time, adjusting to the way you process and respond to what unfolds. And as this recalibration continues, something else becomes more visible. You start to see how external triggers are not the only force driving your experience. There's another layer, quieter but constant, that influences how these events take shape and how long they persist. Because chaos doesn't sustain itself on events alone, it feeds on something much closer to you. Something that operates every moment, often without your awareness, shaping the intensity and duration of everything you go through. Carefully observe how the outside world operates. Alarming news, extreme urgency, shallow drama. The holographic system desperately needs you to believe that danger is imminent because it has no energy of its own. The simulation feeds exclusively on your focused attention. Every time you surrender to despair over something that hasn't even happened yet, you inject your own life force to materialize that problem. Without realizing it, you build your own cage. This isn't about paranoia or blaming the world. It's about understanding a very precise mechanism. Your attention is not passive. It doesn't just register reality, it participates in it. Wherever your focus goes, your internal energy follows. And wherever that energy stays long enough, it begins to organize your perception around it. That's why certain thoughts feel so powerful, not because they are inherently true, but because they capture your attention and hold it. Once that happens, your mind starts generating supporting evidence. It scans your memory, your environment, your expectations, all to confirm the direction of your focus. And suddenly, what started as a small concern becomes a convincing narrative. This is how focus gets hijacked. It rarely happens in an obvious way. It starts subtly, a headline that pulls your curiosity, a comment that triggers irritation, a memory that resurfaces at the wrong time. None of these things are strong on their own, but they are designed, or naturally structured, to hook your attention just enough to keep it engaged. And once you're engaged, the loop begins. You revisit the thought, you analyze it, you imagine outcomes, you react emotionally. And without noticing, you're no longer observing, you're participating. Your body responds as if the situation is real and immediate, even if it exists only in anticipation or memory. The simulation doesn't need a physical event to affect you. It only needs your sustained focus. This is why two people can experience the same external situation in completely different ways. One gets pulled into anxiety, tension, and urgency. The other remains steady, clear, and responsive. The difference is not the event, it's the allocation of attention. Where attention goes, reality organizes. And once you see this, you start to recognize how much of your daily experience is shaped by where your focus is being directed, often without your consent. The constant pull toward urgency is not accidental. Urgency keeps your attention locked. It prevents you from stepping back, from seeing patterns, from choosing consciously where to place your awareness, because choice breaks the loop. If you can notice where your attention is going while it's happening, even for a brief moment, you interrupt the automatic process. You create a gap between the trigger and your response. And in that gap, something shifts. The thought doesn't disappear, but it loses momentum. It's no longer pulling you at the same intensity. It's just there, waiting. And that waiting is important because it reveals something most people never realize. You don't have to follow every thought that appears. But this is where it becomes challenging, because some thoughts come with a strong emotional charge. They feel urgent, important, even necessary. They convince you that ignoring them would be irresponsible, and so you engage, believing you're solving something, when in reality you're reinforcing the loop. This is the deeper layer of the hijacking. It doesn't just capture your attention. It convinces you that your attention must stay there. And the longer it stays, the more your internal state adapts to that frequency. Your body tightens, your breathing changes, your perception narrows. You begin to filter reality through that single channel, missing everything that doesn't match it. This is how a single concern can take over your entire day. Not because it's objectively dominant, but because your focus has excluded everything else. The simulation reflects this narrowing by presenting more of the same. More reasons to worry, more triggers to react, more confirmation that your initial concern was justified. It becomes self-sustaining, unless something interrupts it. And that interruption doesn't come from forcing yourself to think differently. It comes from withdrawing your attention, even slightly, not suppressing the thought, not fighting it, but simply not feeding it with continuous focus. At first, this feels unnatural. Your mind will try to pull you back, reminding you of what you were just thinking about. It will present the same idea again, sometimes with more intensity, but if you don't immediately engage, if you let it pass without attaching to it, the cycle begins to weaken. Because without attention, it has no fuel. And as you practice this, even in small moments, you start to feel a difference, a kind of internal space that wasn't there before. Less pressure, less urgency, more clarity. Not because your external reality has changed yet, but because your relationship with it has shifted. This is where you begin to reclaim something essential. Not control in the sense of forcing outcomes, but control over where your energy flows. And that changes how the entire system responds to you. Because when attention is no longer easily captured, the patterns that depended on it start to lose stability. And once that instability begins, there is a way to accelerate the process, not by adding more effort, but by accessing a state that most people avoid completely, even though it's always available. As I promised to reveal earlier, the definitive way to deactivate the mechanism draining you is not through fighting, but by accessing the physics of the emotional void. When chaos erupts, do not react. Instead of acting with panic or anger, observe the crisis with total and cold neutrality. Relief comes in milliseconds. By removing your emotional voltage, the event loses its source of electricity. The wave does not collapse into more density, and the obstacle begins to dissolve in front of you due to lack of energy. This idea can feel counterintuitive at first. You've been trained to respond, to fix, to defend, to engage. Doing nothing, especially in a moment that feels urgent, can seem irresponsible or even weak. But what you're calling doing nothing is actually a very precise form of awareness. It's the ability to remain present without immediately feeding the situation with reaction. And that changes how the simulation behaves around you, because most of what escalates a situation is not the event itself, but the emotional charge attached to it. The moment something triggers you, your body releases energy, your thoughts accelerate, your attention locks in. And all of that combined creates momentum. The situation begins to grow, not necessarily in reality, but in your experience of it. The emotional void interrupts that momentum. It's not suppression. It's not pretending you don't feel anything. It's allowing the initial reaction to exist without amplifying it. You notice the tension in your chest, the impulse to respond, the thoughts trying to form, and you don't follow them. You let them pass through without adding a second layer. At first, this lasts only a few seconds, but even those few seconds are enough to change the trajectory of what happens next. The intensity drops, the urgency softens. What felt overwhelming becomes something you can actually look at without being pulled into it. There's a moment, very subtle, where you realize the situation is no longer controlling you in the same way. And in that moment, the structure of the problem begins to shift, because without your immediate reaction, the simulation has less to mirror. The feedback loop weakens. The event doesn't disappear, but it stops expanding. It loses that explosive quality that made everything feel out of control. This is why relief can come so quickly. Not because the external world suddenly changed, but because you stopped reinforcing the internal signal that was amplifying it. The energy that was feeding the loop is no longer being supplied at the same intensity. But this requires honesty. You can't fake neutrality. If you're internally resisting, judging, or suppressing, the charge is still there. The void is not about acting calm. It's about actually allowing the reaction to settle without interference. And that takes practice because your system is used to immediate engagement. You'll notice how strong the pull is. The urge to check, to respond, to fix, to think about it just one more time. It feels almost automatic, like something is trying to pull your attention back into the loop. And in a way, that's exactly what's happening. The pattern is trying to sustain itself. But patterns need participation. Without it, they begin to lose coherence. So each time you remain in that neutral observation, even briefly, you weaken the structure. You're not attacking it. You're not replacing it. You're simply not feeding it. And that absence of input creates a kind of silence where the pattern used to operate. In that silence, something new becomes possible. You start to see the situation more clearly, without distortion. Not as a threat, not as something urgent, but as information. And from that place, any action you take is different. It's not reactive. It's precise, minimal, and often more effective than anything you would have done under pressure. This is where real change begins, not from forcing outcomes, but from changing the state from which you engage with them. The simulation responds differently when your internal signal is stable. It no longer needs to escalate to get your attention, because your attention is no longer fragmented, and over time this creates a shift in your baseline. You become less reactive, not because you're detached from life, but because you're no longer entangled in every stimulus that appears. There's space between you and the noise, space to see, to choose, to respond. But this is also where a deeper realization starts to surface, because as you stop reacting and begin observing, the nature of the system itself starts to look different. The idea that something external is controlling or trapping you begins to lose its strength. And a question quietly emerges. If the system loses power when you withdraw your energy, was it ever holding that power on its own? But here is the revelation that subverts all rules and completely shatters everything gurus and conspiracy theorists have taught you. The holographic system was never a dungeon created by dark forces to enslave your soul. Forget that. The Matrix is actually an impeccable technological mirror, programmed by your own higher consciousness before incarnation. It pushes you to the limit not to destroy you, but to force you to remember the absolute creative power you possess. This idea can feel uncomfortable at first, almost provocative, because if the simulation is not your enemy, then the entire narrative of being trapped, controlled, or targeted begins to fall apart. And with it, something else disappears, the role of victim that, in subtle ways, may have been shaping how you interpret your life. It's easier to believe that something external is doing this to you. It gives structure to confusion. It gives a face to discomfort. But it also removes your authority from the equation. Because if something else is in control, then your role becomes limited to reacting, resisting, or trying to escape. And that's exactly the perspective that keeps the loop intact. What if instead, every friction point you experience was designed, not in a rigid, predetermined way, but as a responsive system calibrated to your level of awareness? Not to punish you, but to reveal you to yourself. Look at the patterns in your life. The recurring situations, the familiar emotional triggers, the same types of challenges appearing in different forms. These are not random. They are consistent in a very precise way, almost as if something is presenting you with the same core dynamic until you see it clearly enough to respond differently. That's not a prison, that's feedback. The simulation doesn't need to control you if it can reflect you. And reflection is far more efficient than force. It doesn't impose, it reveals. It shows you, through experience, what is active within you. Not just your thoughts, but your expectations, your assumptions, your unconscious patterns. This is why two people can walk through similar situations and extract completely different realities from them. They're not inside the same version of the simulation. They're interacting with a system that adjusts based on their internal state. Not perfectly, not instantly, but consistently enough that patterns emerge over time. And once you start to see those patterns, something shifts. You stop asking, why is this happening to me? And you begin to ask, what is this showing me about how I'm engaging with reality? That question changes everything, because it redirects your attention from the outside to the interface itself, your perception, your reactions, your focus. It places you back in a position of influence, not by controlling outcomes, but by understanding the input that shapes them. And this is where the idea of builders gets inverted. There are no external architects designing your suffering. The architecture is co-created in real time through your interaction with the system. Your higher awareness isn't separate from this process. It's embedded within it, using the simulation as a medium to communicate through experience. Not through words, but through patterns, through repetition, through contrast. Every time something feels misaligned, that sensation is not there to trap you. It's there to highlight a gap between what you are perceiving and what is actually stable within you. It's a signal, not a sentence. But signals can be misread, especially when they come with intensity. The mind tends to interpret strong sensations as threats, and once something is labeled as a threat, the instinct is to fight it, escape it, or shut it down. But when you do that, you interrupt the very mechanism that was trying to reveal something to you. You turn feedback into conflict, and conflict distorts the reflection. So instead of seeing clearly, you see resistance. Instead of understanding the pattern, you reinforce it, and the simulation, being responsive, continues to present variations of the same dynamic until the distortion clears. Not because it's against you, but because it's precise. It doesn't skip steps, it doesn't force conclusions. It presents, waits, and adjusts based on how you engage. This is why awareness changes everything. Not because it gives you control over every detail, but because it changes how you interpret and respond to what appears. And that, over time, reshapes the entire experience. But there's a key shift that needs to happen for this to fully integrate. You have to move from resisting what you see to allowing it, not as passive acceptance of everything, but as a clear acknowledgement of what is already present. Because the moment you stop treating the reflection as an enemy, the dynamic begins to change. The system no longer needs to push as hard, and when that pressure starts to ease, something unexpected begins to happen. The patterns that once felt persistent start to lose their grip, not because you solved them directly, but because you stopped opposing the mechanism that was holding them in place. The exact moment you understand that the simulation is your creation, not your enemy, the code of the game flips upside down. By radically accepting your current reality, even with all its uncertainty and limitations, the hologram loses its reason to test you. Absolute acceptance destroys the algorithm of suffering from the inside out. When you stop punching your own reflection, doors begin to open on their own. This kind of acceptance is often misunderstood. It's not giving up, it's not saying, this is my life and nothing can change. It's something much more precise. It's the removal of internal resistance to what is already present. You're no longer arguing with reality in your own mind. And that argument, more than anything else, is what keeps the cycle alive. When something happens and you immediately think, this shouldn't be like this, you create friction. That friction doesn't fix the situation. It locks your attention onto it. It tightens your body, narrows your perception, and feeds the same loop that has been repeating in different forms. The simulation reads that resistance as a signal, not a conscious message, but a pattern of tension that says, this is unresolved, and as long as that signal is active, the system continues to reflect it back to you, not because it wants to trap you, but because it's still receiving the same input. Acceptance interrupts that signal. The moment you stop internally rejecting what is happening, even if you don't like it, something shifts. The tension begins to dissolve. The situation may still exist externally, but your relationship to it changes immediately. There is more space, more clarity, and less urgency. And in that space, the pattern loses its fuel. This is why acceptance can feel so powerful and so strange at the same time. You're not doing anything in the traditional sense. You're not fixing, changing, or controlling. You're allowing. And yet, that allowing has a direct effect on how things unfold. Because resistance was the glue holding the cycle together. Without it, the structure starts to loosen. The same triggers don't produce the same reactions, the same situations don't escalate in the same way. It's as if the system no longer recognizes the old pattern it was responding to. But there's an important detail here. Acceptance has to be real. If you say, "I accept this," while internally hoping it disappears as fast as possible, the resistance is still there. It's just hidden under a layer of words. The simulation doesn't respond to what you say, it responds to what you actually hold. Real acceptance feels different, it's quiet. There's no urgency in it, no hidden negotiation. It's a simple acknowledgement. This is what is here right now. And for a moment, you stop trying to push it away or pull it closer. That moment is enough. Because in that moment, you're no longer feeding the cycle. You're no longer reinforcing the pattern through reaction. And the system, having no resistance to mirror, begins to adjust. You might notice small changes first. A situation resolves itself without effort. A conversation that would normally turn into conflict stays neutral. A problem that felt urgent suddenly loses its intensity. These are not coincidences. They are the natural result of a shift in how you're engaging with the simulation. But this process is not linear. There will be moments where resistance comes back. Old habits, old reactions, old impulses to control or fix. That doesn't mean you've failed. It means the pattern is still unwinding. And each time you notice it and return to acceptance, you weaken it further. Over time, something stabilizes. You stop reacting to every fluctuation. You stop seeing every challenge as a threat. There's a growing sense that you can remain steady even when things around you are changing. Not because you've gained control over everything, but because you've stopped fighting what you cannot control. And that changes how the simulation organizes itself around you. Because without resistance, there's no need for constant correction, no need for repeated signals. The system becomes quieter, more responsive, less chaotic. Not perfect, but more aligned with your actual state. And this is where a deeper shift begins to take shape. Because as resistance fades, something else becomes more visible. A kind of natural flow that was always there, but hidden under layers of tension and reaction. It doesn't force outcomes, it doesn't rush, but it moves with a precision that doesn't rely on effort. You start to notice that certain things begin to align without you pushing them. Opportunities appear in simple ways. Conversations unfold with less friction. Decisions become clearer, not because you analyzed every detail, but because there's less noise interfering with your perception. And that leads to a realization that goes beyond acceptance itself. Because once resistance is no longer driving your experience, you begin to see patterns of organization that feel almost too precise to be random. Events connecting in ways that seem unlikely. Outcomes arriving through paths you wouldn't have predicted. At first, it feels coincidental, but as it repeats, it starts to feel structured. And that's when you begin to sense that there's a kind of order operating beneath the surface, one that becomes visible only when your internal state is no longer distorting it. As you anchor this new posture, events that defy logic will begin to occur in the coming days. Low-frequency people will organically disappear from your life. Money and solutions will fall into your lap through improbable routes, and precise numerical synchronicities will follow you all day long. This is not blind mysticism. It is the biological and electromagnetic validation that your new vibrational signature has already taken over the timeline. What feels like coincidence starts to reveal a pattern. At first, you might dismiss it. A message arriving at the exact moment you needed it. A delay that seemed frustrating, but ends up preventing a bigger problem. Someone stepping out of your life without conflict, as if the connection simply lost its structure. These moments don't announce themselves as important, but they carry a kind of quiet precision. And the more you observe, the harder it becomes to ignore. Because the simulation begins to respond with a different kind of consistency. Not the old repetition of problems, but a new alignment between your internal state and external outcomes. It's not perfect, and it's not constant, but it's noticeable. There's less friction in simple things. Decisions unfold with less doubt. Even challenges arrive with a different tone, less chaotic, more contained. This is where the idea of mathematics becomes real. Not as numbers on a page, but as a kind of order that governs how your experience organizes itself. Every thought you sustain, every emotion you reinforce, every moment of awareness you stabilize, it all contributes to a pattern. And that pattern has consequences, not in a moral sense, but in a structural one. If your internal state is scattered, your experience reflects fragmentation. If your state is reactive, your environment mirrors unpredictability. But when your state becomes coherent, when your attention, your perception, and your responses are aligned, something changes in how reality arranges itself around you. The output becomes more predictable, not in the sense that you can control every detail, but in the sense that certain types of outcomes become more likely. Clarity leads to cleaner decisions. Cleaner decisions reduce unnecessary complications. Reduced complications create space for opportunities that were previously hidden under noise. This is not luck, it's accumulation. Small shifts in awareness compound over time. The way you pause instead of reacting. The way you allow instead of resist. The way you observe instead of immediately engaging. These are subtle changes, but they have a measurable effect on how you move through the simulation. And the system registers that, not as a reward, but as a recalibration. It begins to trust your input more, in a sense. Your responses become less erratic, more stable, and the feedback you receive reflects that stability. Situations resolve with less escalation. Interactions become more direct. There's less need for repeated signals because you're already processing what's being shown. This is what sovereignty actually looks like. Not control over everything, but coherence within yourself. And from that coherence, a different kind of influence emerges. You don't force outcomes, you allow them to organize around a clearer signal. And that signal is not something you project outward, it's something you maintain internally. But this is where it's important to stay grounded. Because the mind can quickly turn these experiences into exaggerated meanings. Seeing patterns doesn't mean everything is a sign. Not every number, not every coincidence, not every alignment carries a hidden message. If you start assigning meaning to everything, you reintroduce noise into a system that was becoming clear. This is one of the most subtle forms of self-deception. The desire to confirm that something special is happening can lead you to overinterpret what you see. And once that happens, you shift from observation back into projection. You're no longer reading the system. You're writing over it with expectations. And expectations, when rigid, distort the feedback. So the key here is balance. You notice the patterns, but you don't cling to them. You allow the synchronicities, but you don't depend on them. You stay present with what is actually happening, instead of building a narrative around what you think it means. Because the real change is not in the events themselves. It's in how stable you remain while they happen. That stability is what defines your position within the simulation. It determines whether you're being pulled by every fluctuation or moving through them with clarity. And as that stability deepens, something else begins to emerge, a sense that time itself is behaving differently. Moments feel more immediate. Decisions carry more weight. The gap between intention and result seems to shrink, not because everything happens instantly, but because there's less internal delay. And that points to something even more fundamental. Because beneath all these shifts, patterns, alignment, coherence, there is a single point where everything is actually being processed, a point that doesn't exist in the past or the future, but only in one place. And understanding that point changes how you engage with everything else. The world taught you to wait for a future celestial event, a savior, or an astrological date to finally be free. But the physics of the universe only executes commands in the now. As you process these exact words, old neural networks of scarcity are dying in your brain, and your administrator state of reality is fully downloading. Your awakening is not tomorrow, it is now. The waiting is over. This idea is simple, but it changes everything when you actually feel it. Most of your life has been organized around later. Later I'll fix this. Later I'll feel better. Later things will align. That constant projection into the future creates a gap between where you are and where you think things need to be. And inside that gap, there's tension, doubt, and a subtle sense that something is always missing. But the simulation doesn't operate in later. It responds only to what is active in your system right now. Not what you plan to feel, not what you hope will happen, but what is actually present in your awareness in this exact moment. That is the only point where input becomes output. And this is where most people lose access to their own influence, because they are rarely here. Their body is here, but their attention is somewhere else, replaying the past, anticipating the future, trying to solve something that isn't even happening right now. And while that might feel productive, it actually disconnects them from the only place where change can occur. The present is not just a moment in time, it's an interface. It's where perception, decision, and action converge. It's where your internal state meets the external structure of the simulation. And when you're fully here, even briefly, something becomes available that isn't accessible any other way. Clarity without effort. You don't have to search for it. It's already there, but it gets covered by noise when your attention is split. The moment you return to now, not conceptually, but directly, you begin to notice things differently. Your breathing slows, your body softens, your thoughts lose some of their urgency. And in that shift, your perception sharpens. You start to see what actually needs your attention and what doesn't. You stop reacting to imagined scenarios and begin responding to what is real. And that alone reduces a huge amount of unnecessary complexity in your experience, because most of what drains you isn't happening now. It's happening in your then, in projections, in loops that feel real but aren't grounded in the present moment. When you step out of those loops, even for a few seconds, the difference is immediate. There's less pressure, less confusion, more space to move. This is the 0 point, not a mystical place, but a state where your attention is no longer scattered, where you're not pulled in multiple directions at once, where your awareness is stable enough to register what's actually happening without distortion. And from that state, your actions change. They become simpler, more direct. You don't overthink as much, you don't hesitate as long, you respond to what's in front of you instead of trying to manage everything at once. And because of that, your interaction with the simulation becomes more efficient. There's less delay between input and response. This is what people often describe as things flowing. Not because life suddenly becomes perfect, but because you're no longer interfering with the process through constant distraction or resistance. You're aligned with the only moment that actually exists, and that alignment creates a kind of natural momentum. But staying in this state is not something you force. If you try to hold on to the present, it turns into another effort, another layer of tension. The point is not to control your attention perfectly. It's to return again and again whenever you notice you've drifted, and that noticing is enough. Each time you come back, even briefly, you reinforce a different pattern, one where awareness is not lost in automatic loops, but grounded in direct experience. Over time, that pattern becomes more stable, and as it stabilizes, something deeper begins to shift. You start to feel less dependent on external timing, less attached to when things should happen. There's a growing sense that what needs to unfold will do so through your interaction with the present, not through waiting for the right moment to arrive. Because the right moment is always this one. And when you fully understand that, not just intellectually but experientially, the entire dynamic of waiting collapses. You're no longer preparing to live. You're already inside the point where everything is being created. That realization doesn't come with noise or intensity. It's quiet, but it's undeniable. And once you feel it, even for a second, it becomes clear that what you've been looking for was never in the future. It was always embedded in your ability to be here, fully, without delay. And from that point, the way you move, decide, and respond begins to carry a different quality. One that no longer depends on chasing or resisting, but on something much more direct and immediate. The old system has exhausted all its resources trying to keep you asleep, but the fact that you are here proves the matrix has failed. The power to collapse matter now obeys only you, because you stopped playing by the rules and started dictating the source code. The preparation is over, and sovereign life has begun. Leave in the comments, "I take control of the simulation," to physically and mentally register that the illusion has fallen and your total freedom has just begun. Now stay with this feeling for a second. No rush, no pressure. Just notice the clarity, the space, the silence that is available when you stop feeding the old loops. This is not something you need to chase anymore. It's something you return to again and again until it becomes your natural state. If this connected with you, watch one of the videos on your screen right now. Keep going deeper while this awareness is active, and if you want to support the channel and access exclusive content that's coming soon, consider becoming a member.